Hello, everyone. I'm giving everyone a moment or so to join and get settled. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I am Ashley Sklar, the Adult Services and Community Engagement Consultant with the Connecticut State Library Division of Library Development. Together with my colleague, Kimberly Poe, who is here somewhere, there she is, in one of these boxes, our children and young adult consultant. We're pleased to be bringing you the next iteration of Growing Equitable Library Services. This is a series that we have been collaborating on and thinking about, and it is new and it will continue into 2022. So we are very excited. Our goal with GELS is to provide offerings that build all of our understandings as librarians and library staff, that much of our work has a really strong common thread. We all need to consider how to create more accessible, DEI conscious libraries with services really rooted in social justice. So for this session, we're really excited to partner with DataHaven to introduce their work and focus on their 2021 Connecticut Town Equity Reports. I know most of you are probably, or a lot of you are familiar with this, but it's good to have them here to take a deep dive with us. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome Mark Abraham, Executive Director, and Camille Seaberry, Senior Research Associate, and I will turn it over to them in just a moment. We are, as you probably noted, recording today's session, and it will be available along with the slides after our program on our GELS YouTube playlist, which I believe Kim put in the chat for you all already. We do have the live captioning feature turned on, so please feel free to adjust that for your use as needed. I will be here throughout, keeping an eye on the chat, as I'm sure our presenters will do as well. So feel free to drop your questions there. And we will also, as we always do, follow up with you after the session with a really brief survey. So please take a moment, share your feedback with us. It helps us keep planning. So thank you. And with that, let me turn it over to Mark and Camille to get us started.
Thank you, Ashley. And thanks everyone for joining today. If you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, like just in your name and what town you're in or what librarian, that could be helpful for us just to see who's here. So you're welcome to do that. And I think we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions as well during the hour. So with that, I'll ask if Camille wants to share our slides, begin with those. So next slide. Great. I want to go to the first slide.
Is that showing up okay?
Yeah, you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So again, thanks for those introductions in the chat. So at DataHaven, we wanted to create these town reports basically due to the requests that we were getting from organizations throughout the state. I should probably step back and just, for those of you not familiar with DataHaven, it's a nonprofit. It's been around for about 25 years, and it's a partnership of public and private groups around the state. Our goal is to make information accessible. So one of the things we do is provide technical assistance to organizations like libraries, towns, other nonprofits in the state. We'll get, very commonly like requests for information from like newspapers, community groups, that sort of thing, just looking for data about their communities. So these town reports really came out of that process. I think we were getting lots of requests for more detailed town data than what's normally available on the public data websites. So we decided to create this product to address that need. And building off that, if you have this is version 1 of the town reports. If you have comments, things you'd like to see in them in the future, we're really keen on getting those suggestions from you. We've already had, just from the initial release in September, many comments and suggestions from like state agencies, from local partners about how to improve the reports for version 2. So we definitely encourage you to contact us if you have thoughts on that. And the data sources we'll talk about mainly today are the listed here. So again, we were trying to take information that exists in some form, like on the census website or elsewhere, and be able to break it down so it's more relevant for our towns. And specifically breaking it down by demographic factors, so such as race and ethnicity, we thought was important. That was where there wasn't necessarily information readily available from the census website. So we took data from the 2020 census that was newer, the American Community Survey, specifically like the microdata files, which are more like the raw data from the survey, essentially, that are more difficult to access. And then data from state and other federal agencies, including some new data sources that had just been released recently. And also the community wellbeing survey that DataHaven conducts. We just wrapped up the 2021 survey, which was throughout the state. So that will be included in version 2 of the reports. So these reports really focus on data from the 2015 and 2018 surveys. Those were live interviews, in-depth, actual conversations with about 32,000 randomly selected adults in every town in Connecticut. So that data source provides, basically it's designed to collect information that's not available from other sources like quality of life, health, and economic issues, and civic participation, things like that. So yeah, that's just an overview of what data you'll see in the reports. In the first month or so, about 3,000 people downloaded the reports, which was exciting, and we saw a lot of coverage and use of these. We're still doing common, pretty frequent lectures about the reports at different venues so that people are aware that they're out there. Again, especially given that the information in the reports was not previously available, publicly to anyone in the state. So it's sort of a new source of information people can use to describe their communities. And the audiences for the reports, again, these were based on like the questions and comments we got from our partners and from people throughout the state looking for this sorts of data. So we envision, the primary audience would be residents. So the reports are like, a little bit simpler than some of the other DataHaven reports on our website. They're, not as granular information, and the charts are bigger and hopefully easier for residents to follow. A subgroup of that that's specifically interested in the data on race and ethnicity would be the town committees on anti-racism, racism, public health, and inclusion. Some of those, quite a few of those actually were formed in mid-2020 in towns throughout the state, and they were, looking for data about their town. So then we've also seen like elected officials and candidates use these nonprofits that are writing grants, to serve their towns. Many of those nonprofits are already familiar with DataHaven because they use our other reports in their grant requests, but this gives them like a little bit more of a local focus. And then also we have classroom materials for teachers and some specialized materials for like legislators. So next slide. So these are just some examples, like right when we first published the report, op-eds and news coverage kind of broadcasting that these were out there. So we didn't really push this out ourselves. People just sort of found the reports and started writing about them. So it was a good sign that the information was easy to access. Next slide. And then I just wanted to describe, before Camille gets into the specifics of the data, some of the limitations to keep in mind when you're using these resources. Some of the charts don't show up for every small group. So the reports cover all 169 towns. Most of the charts are included for each town, but there are a few cases where like the towns are very small, where we'll leave out a chart, especially for very small towns, like with less than 1,000 residents or so. For those, the approach would be to use like your regional or statewide data as a benchmark. So Camille will talk about that, but there's different geographic levels you could use as alternatives if data is not available for your town. And same would be for racial and ethnic groups. Like you may see data for, if you're in a town with many residents who identify as Latino, you may see data for white residents, for Latinos, and the total, but not for the African-American population of the town. So it's just it depends on the population and sampling to determine what is reported or reportable by state agencies as well. The disparities that you'll notice in the report, many racial disparities along like economic, housing, health lines. We just wanted to note those can disguise some of the smaller groups within each category. So especially if you think of like Asian Americans having the highest income in Connecticut, that sort of disguises the fact that, you know, within the Asian American group, incomes can range from like $150,000 to $25,000 or something like that, based on the specific or migrant group and or Asian origin group that you're looking at. So it's important to note that, you know, those averages can kind of disguise that the disparities. And you'll see a video on our site that gets into that issue in Connecticut in more detail on our DataHaven YouTube page. The other thing is the reports use data from the census on Native American race. That's, you know, the census asks you your racial identification. One of the options is Native American or Alaska Native. And we just wanted to note that's not the same as tribal affiliation necessarily. There may be many adults who identify as Native American, but they're not necessarily part of a tribe, recognized tribe. So that, you know, it's an important limitation of the way to use that data. And then, like I said, the reports are a little bit simplified. There aren't a lot of like detailed description or references like we have in our other reports. So if you would like a longer discussion of the indicators in the reports, like for redlining or housing, for example, we encourage users to refer to our health equity report or our community wellbeing index that have like a much longer discussion of those issues. Next slide. And just wanted to say thanks to the sponsors, the funders of the report themselves, and the report authors, as well as the funders of the survey, which is one of the larger data sources used in the report. Next slide. Thank you.
Okay, so I can go into talking, I'll try to be brief, but talking a little bit about some of the data sources and kind of our approach to this project. So we originally thought about it as just having a way to disseminate data on different towns, on every town in the state, just to have, to like let residents have kind of local sources of information, just kind of like overview, because we really couldn't get, you know, it's still a pretty short report. There's not a whole lot of text in it. So there were a lot of things where, you know, we really could have gotten into, like any one of the sections in it could be its own report on its own. But as we got started doing it, we were kind of realizing like, okay, all these breakdowns, we're really seeing this, you know, kind of these patterns of equity, inequity, racial inequality, income inequality, that kind of histories of segregation, that kind of are like underlining most of the issues that we talk about in Connecticut. So a lot of the health indicators that we look at, a lot of education, housing, a lot of these things that we look at kind of come down to where people live, what the conditions are like in that neighborhood, things like that, that really become kind of pervasive throughout the course of people's lives and throughout their family and well-being, and just really all facets of life. And so, yeah, so we decided that we wanted to make sure that we were approaching things where, as much as possible, we were breaking things down. A lot of times just by race and ethnicity. Sometimes that's the only breakdowns that are available, depending on the data source and the granularity that the data allow. There were a few cases where we were able to break things down by maybe race and age and start to disentangle more patterns, or race and sex. But yeah, really just anywhere that we could do smaller breakdowns while still maintaining the integrity of the data. That was kind of our, kind of became our goal for this. So I have just a few examples from the reports. I think all of these are from the Hamden report. So one thing first that I'll mention, it's a little bit of a kind of wonky thing, but we wanted to be able to have wherever we could have state data, have town data, and then have some sort of region to compare that town to. So some area that was maybe a few towns surrounding whatever town the focus was on. If it's a city, maybe that the city and its suburbs. So what we ended up using was, they're labeled as PUMAs and then a string of numbers after it, an identifier. So that's a public use microdata area, and that's a census designation. It's generally, in most cases, it's a few towns. It's a cluster of a few, maybe like 4 or 5 neighboring towns. It's always a contiguous area. For some of the less populated areas, it'll be an entire county. So like Litchfield County is one PUMA altogether. But so when you see that, that's what that is. So the one for Hamden, I can't remember exactly which towns it is, but it's maybe 5 or 6 towns. And there's kind of advantages and disadvantages to that. So we wanted to be able to have some sort of benchmark that's not just the entire state, but a local benchmark as well. We also wanted to be able to, in cases where there wasn't data available for a specific town, so some of those indicators where we were kind of getting into more disaggregations by race or by age, or just indicators that are, you know, kind of depend on having a decent sample size. If we couldn't get data for the town, we wanted to be able to get what was kind of the next best thing. So we decided that the next best thing for, say, a town like Hamden, that's, you know, a decent sized population, but if we couldn't get data for something for Hamden alone, the next best was to have this cluster of 5 or 6 towns that are local, rather than defaulting to some region like the county or the entire state that might not have as much in common with that specific town. And that's especially just because we know that so many of these things are local and so many of these things are kind of concentrated. So if you're, you know, you want data on some poverty related measure and you're looking at, say, New Britain. If you don't have data available for just the town of New Britain, defaulting to all of Hartford County or all of the state isn't really going to be representative of New Britain and its, you know, what things are like there and its surrounding area. So that's that. I know that that's something that people aren't necessarily used to seeing, but that was kind of the choice that we made there. So a lot of our data is from the US Census Bureau. One of our major sources is the American Community Survey. It comes out every year, except so far this year, it is delayed because of COVID and funding issues that the Census Bureau had. But generally it comes out every year, and it comes out in these 5-year averages. So most of the things in these reports are averaged out over 5 years. We kind of report them as the end year. So a lot of the data here will say 2019. And those are cases where it's averaged out over 5 years, ending in 2019. And the American Community Survey, if people haven't worked with it before, highly recommend it. I think it's super, super interesting. It's got just, you know, the decennial census, the one that's every 10 years, is more just kind of straightforward, population, age, race, housing conditions, but not a whole lot of detail and not a whole lot of, doesn't give you as much of a sense of who really lives in a place, and just other things about their lives. So the ACS, the American Community Survey, it's a sample of, I think about 5% of the population every year. So it's not a full count the way that the decennial census is, but the ACS gets into all of these issues of like migration, the language you speak at home, education levels, SNAP utilization, having internet at home, commute, like really just this like wealth of information about people's lives that has, just tons and tons of uses. And so one of the main takeaways that we saw with this was just lots of different ways that the state is diversifying. So both the state as a whole and to different levels by different amounts within different towns also, and just seeing how like things are shifting. So again, looking at the ways that a lot of issues, both like strengths and challenges, tend to be kind of clustered in different places. So kind of starting to think about what are some of the ways that those things will be shifting in coming years. So one of the things that we really wanted to focus on, like I mentioned and Mark mentioned, is if we're really going to talk about equity, having to break things down more than what we might be used to. So folks might be familiar with looking at homeownership by race. I know that we've worked on a few projects that were kind of specific to like Black homeownership in New Haven or in like surrounding towns. So that's one thing that people might be used to seeing. We decided to break that down further by age, because when you start to do that, you'll see that, younger adults are less likely to own a home than older adults, and particularly seniors, so 65 plus. But when you break that down by both race and age, then you start to see that, in a lot of places, actually like homeownership for younger white adults might be on par with that of Black and Latino older adults. So starting to see these ways that wealth for white families is starting to accumulate even, under the age of 35 in people's kind of young adulthood, being able to start building that foundation of wealth and stability and access to resources and all these things that aren't really coming about for older adults or for Black and Latino adults until their older years. And so then again, this is one of those things where there's some things being disguised, even within the data being broken down like this, so this is for that region that I mentioned around Hamden. My suspicion would be that a large share of those houses that are owned by Black people are still concentrated in really just parts of Hamden. I haven't looked into that for sure, so like nobody should quote me on that. But even within a breakdown like this, we tend to see clustering and concentrations into certain areas as well. So another example that we did was looking at the wage gap. So when people talk about a wage gap, they're usually talking about the amount of money that women make versus men. Sometimes that's controlled for full-time versus part-time. Sometimes it's not. So we decided we would control for just full-time year-round workers. And we would take another look at that. And, and of course we did find wage gaps between men and women. And we know just kind of overall, Connecticut has a pretty high median income compared to the US and compared to states in, outside of New England.
Hey there.
We wanted to break that down a little bit more. So not just women versus men, but also by race. And so when we did that, again, we started to see multiple gaps opening up. And actually some patterns that became a little bit counterintuitive, so that it's not just across the board women making less than men, but there are gaps that are sometimes smaller between Black men and Black women and between Latino men and Latino women. In some places, Black men and women earn about the same. Some places, Latina women out-earn Latino men. But in a lot of places, what we were also seeing was that there's these gaps that are white women versus Black men and women and Latino men and women. So kind of another kind of taking that, what we normally think of as a wage gap, and kind of flipping it a little bit to see like, well, there's actually multiple wage gaps at play here. It's not, you know, just quite so simple as women make this amount of money on the dollar. And so then, like I mentioned, there's all of these implications of where you live, where you grew up, what are the conditions where you are that really play out throughout your life. And so one of the places where we see that is in life expectancy, where we'll see sometimes, you know, kind of crossing a boundary from one town to the next, or even crossing from one side of a street to another within a town, you'll see life expectancy jump by several years, by more than a decade in some places. So it kind of becomes this culmination of all of these other factors that are connected to these kind of patterns that we see throughout all of these different indicators, you know, kind of then culminate in like, well, how long are you able to live? And then one last thing that I thought was interesting that we did here that we hadn't done as much in other places was looking at a few measures that are defined as being part of equity. And so this is also something that we do in the community index reports we put out every 3 years. We've had a couple different ways that we've tried to kind of boil down a number of different issues into a single index to be able to compare, like, here's the financial security of this group kind of overall across, you know, 4 or 5 measures versus the financial security of this other group. So a similar thing that we looked at here is this environmental justice index from the EPA. And so the way that they do this is they look at environmental hazards all across the country. So things like the risk of exposure to lead paint through like old housing stock, proximity to water treatment facilities, proximity to highways, and, you know, therefore air pollution risks. And so they put out an index that's first, it's not like units that you might think of. It's not really like a percentage or anything, but it's a ranking of low risk through high risk. And it's a percentile across the entire country. And it's done with these really local level areas of just a few blocks apiece. And so they do that first index just straight across the country, but then they do an adjusted version that they scale based on groups that they've identified as being particularly vulnerable to those sorts of risk factors. So they have a simple version and a more complicated version. We worked with their simple version that's scaled by the low-income population and the population of people of color in each of those neighborhoods. And so that's really a way of taking into account not just what the risks are, but how able might people be to kind of deal with those risks, advocate for themselves with those risks around them, have resources to deal with those risks. They did a version that also included, I think, senior populations and child populations, and I think limited English speakers. So again, just looking at like the resources that people have available and the ways that they can kind of fight for the well-being of their neighborhood. So that's a way that you can not only look at data through an equity lens, but also be defining what the data even is, what you're measuring, defining that as a kind of equity measure. So that's just a handful of examples. The full reports for every town are on DataHaven's website. I put a short link here, but you can just go to ctdatahaven.org as well and go through to the reports. And like Mark mentioned, this is kind of our version 1. We want to do a version 2 sometime next year when more data are available as well. And then next up, we were going to do an activity. So I don't know if either Mark or Ashley wants to say anything here, but the next thing was going to be breakout sessions.
Yeah, this will give you a chance to look at the report for your town. We have some questions, and we'll be in the rooms to guide you through that. Before we go there, I guess if anyone has a question, there were a couple I answered in the chat, but if other folks want to unmute or turn on their cameras and ask a question, I think we have a couple time for like maybe 2 questions. There's a couple in the chat we could take live. Differential privacy, so that's the census in how it's reporting data in the future. It's going to do some, add some statistical noise to the estimates, especially for like very small areas. So yeah, that could have some impacts on like estimates for small towns and groups within towns, like you know, young children or that sort of thing. But that will be something we look at going forward. It's not currently much of an issue for the towns.
Yeah, I think that's starting with the 2020 decennial census data, which is late. So that's not out yet. So we, there was only a little bit of data. The data that they use for the congressional districting is the only 2020 data that's available now, which I don't believe had differential privacy.
And then mixed race. So if people are like choose 2 or more races on the census form, they are counted as, you'll see in the chart there, like the other group, unless they're Latino, because Latinos are classified for the purpose of this report. They're classified as Latino regardless of what their racial choices are. There are other ways to do that. That's sort of the most common, I think. And you'll see the largest increases generally were among people who report being of mixed race or other races, but it's still, you know, it's still by percentage terms a small percent of the total population of the state.
Okay, well, I'm gonna take advantage of the lull and just let you know you're going into 2 breakout rooms. One will be with Mark, one with Camille, so you'll have experts right there for you. And I'm gonna set them for 15 minutes, so we will see everyone back here at the end.
So I think everyone is back, and in our breakout session, we got some good suggestions just on presenting the data, you know, some ways to label things better. So those are all really useful. We're getting like feedback that we can incorporate into the next report. Did anyone from our group want to discuss like the sort of other questions and prompts that came up, or offer any reactions? No? How about Camille, do you want to give a quick report back?
Yeah, I'll say first that next time we need more time. And that, yeah, second, I think if people can chime in for sure, but yeah, there were just a number of things where people expected numbers to be higher or lower. So like the adults without a high school diploma, a couple people said that they were surprised that it was as low as it was, which, you know, that's great. It's always nice to have those pleasant surprises in this sort of data. But yeah, I think just kind of knowing your community and then finding out numbers about it that are not quite what you would have guessed is always interesting. But yeah, if anybody from my group wants to share more than that, please do.
I was in Mark's group, but I can share how wonderful this information would be to support grant applications and grant reporting and program planning, just in terms of helping us as librarians to uncover who is in our communities and who we may not be reaching and how we might be able to respond to them. So I love the fact that these are detailed and lengthy and meaty and rich, and that you have put so much work into them. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll say I worked in grant writing before I worked at DataHaven, and I use DataHaven's resources all the time for it. So I recommend our stuff just from that experience as well for grant writing and for getting kind of those like, yeah, less common sorts of measures of what neighborhoods are like.
Jane, do you have your hand raised?
I do. So I actually have already used the data to write a grant, which was funded for DEI work. So thank you. But what was on my mind, and I thought about this when we were in our group, because it was hard actually answering all these questions in such a short time. And then we didn't have time that much to talk about the big question is what might we do with this as librarians? And one thought I had is, it would be great to have an opportunity to gather with my local partners and look at this data together and ask the whys about these questions, especially where there are inequities. Why might that be in my community? And probably at this point, I don't feel qualified necessarily to lead that conversation, but it might be something where we could pool some resources and bring in an expert to help us and maybe conduct a session locally with this data. I'm just throwing that out there as an idea.
Yeah, that's great. We do, like we said, that we do a lot of sort of lectures, community programs and things. So if there's like a group of folks in your town or a library board or that sort of thing, feel free to reach out and we can talk through the data that way, or connect you to groups in the area that are like sort of doing health assessment or this type of other folks in the area who are interested in that. So thank you so much for participating in the event. We really appreciate all your feedback. Like as you look through these more, hopefully use them. Definitely send us suggestions through email because we're already planning a lot of updates for the next version. And I don't know if Ashley wants to add anything before we close out.
Well, just more thank you. So thank you. Big thanks to Mark and Camille for joining us today. Thank you all for taking the time to learn together. It sounds like maybe you're leaving with some more questions, but maybe you have the information and data to start to get to some more answers. And again, when you do get the survey, give us feedback. We're certainly open to bringing DataHaven back for more. So share it with us if that would be useful for you. And otherwise, again, thank you everyone for your time and take care and enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.